The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome back to the show. I'm in conversation with the wonderful Sashi Perera, lawyer, comedian. Sashi, we're meeting after 1 year.
Yes,
and so much has happened.
Too much, some would say, but
yeah.
yes.
Tell us what's been going on with you.
Well, since I last saw you, that was my first very small show in Sri Lanka, and now I'm just about to do my next big one here in Galle. I've written a book. I've been touring around the UK, around Australia, and I'm going to do my first show in Singapore. So it feels like so much has happened since I last saw you. It's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah.
Likewise. Tell us a bit about your book as well.
So I was supposed to get married here in Sri Lanka 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago actually, and didn't. That was cancelled 2 months before the day. And it was a very difficult time, but it also was a very formative time. And I've got to go back and revisit that time. And it's the draft is in. The draft is in, and it's going to be published in August. Beautiful. So it's been a really nice process. I'm quite afraid that everyone will hate it, but apparently that's a normal feeling. So I'm trying to push through that.
Yeah. What was the process like for you to make yourself so vulnerable and revisit some of the most difficult, challenging times in your life?
I think having a lot of distance from it actually happening made it so much easier to write about. I think it would have been very difficult to write that story without knowing that everything is okay now.
Right.
And I think I needed to know that I was okay before I could write this story. So I think having a lot of distance has been really great. And also my first comedy show was also, it started with me not getting married as I was supposed to. So I think that was very helpful. But what I've found is that writing a book is just much more vulnerable and exposing than a comedy show ever has been. So it's been an interesting process.
Okay. I'd like to bring in gender. Female comedians. Most men think women aren't funny, but here you are, thrive. See so many amazing, incredibly funny, intelligent, empathetic women who are taking over the comedy spaces around the world. What are your perspectives on that?
I hope we've settled the conversation that women aren't funny. I think we can conclusively agree that a lot of women are funny. And I'm hoping that the conversation is changing, the baseline is changing, but I think it's really difficult to get on stage as a woman. And, it's hard to get on stage for anyone, but I think especially as a woman, especially if you're raised in a certain culture in a certain way, you're expected to be quiet, you're expected to be obedient, you're expected to not be too loud and not be too raucous and boisterous. So I think that the more women that do it, the more the perception will change. So I'm hoping that by getting on stage, I'm encouraging everyone else to get out there, grab the microphone. Yeah.
Okay. Being a woman in comedy is hard, but being a brown woman in comedy is hard because we are in a world that is dominated by a Eurocentric narrative largely. How did you overcome that? How did you look at your shifting identity, your Sri Lankan, living in Australia, married to an Australian?
Yeah. I think I've just started comedy at such a great time, and I've just tried to encourage as many people as possible to tell them that there is space for you, because I think the feeling like you are always going to be your biggest obstacle, because from what you're seeing around you, the message is that there's no space here for you. You know, it's full, we're full. But actually, there's so much space. That's what I'm learning. And I think now there are so many more comedians to look up to. There are so many brown comedians taking the world by storm, and female comedians taking the world by storm. So I think I've just started at this wonderful time where I have so many people around me to look up to and to reach out to for help and for advice. And there's an incredible network of women and men and just people who are just supporting new voices in comedy. So it's a good time to be a brown woman in comedy. That's what I reckon.
Sashi, speak to us also about how comedy makes it a little less difficult to speak about things which are difficult to talk about on their own.
Difficult topics in comedy, I think that it's very hard to joke about something unless you've had a lot of distance from it. So that's what a lot of advice that I give to newer comedians is, if you're not ready to joke about it, you don't have to joke about it. You can joke about whatever you want. So I think just make sure that you're ready to talk about whatever it is that you're ready to talk about. And yeah, I think people are averse to difficult discussions, but if you wrap it in a joke, they're much more likely to listen and to hear what you're trying to say.
We're in an increasingly warring world, a world where a lot of societal desensitization is rampant. In such a context, do you think comedy has a role to play in bridging the gaps that exist, bridging the disconnect that exists?
I think there is a huge disconnect. I think a lot of us have forgotten that it's okay to disagree. I think those conversations are becoming so much harder, where you draw your line in the sand and they draw their line in the sand, and no one's going to find mutual ground. And I think comedy for me is an antidote to the news, because the news tells me that everyone hates each other and everything's horrible out there. But then when you go to live comedy, there are so many people in a room and they're all laughing together about different things. And I think that has definitely bridged that feeling of loneliness for me, that feeling of increasingly being isolated in a world where we used to, it used to be okay to disagree, and now it very much isn't. You're either on this side or you're on that side, and they are very much warring with each other. So I think being in a live theatre, experiencing things together, building that sense of community again, means that we don't have to agree on everything, but we can find some mutual ground.
Sashi, let's talk a bit more about your comedy. How do you know when a joke is ready for the audience?
I don't think you ever know, and that's why stand-up comedy is so brutal sometimes, because you just have to get on stage and test it. But that moment when you realize that what you think inside your head and wrote alone in a room is funny, and then you present it on stage and people react the way you expect to, like, that is the absolute payoff for me. So I have a whole running folder of notes in my phone of things that I think are funny, and I'll try to develop some of them into jokes. But honestly, I never know which ones are going to work and which ones aren't until I get on stage and try them out. And that's why it's a brutal process where you have to fail again and again and be okay with it. And I think as a lawyer, like with the type of training that you do, you're not taught to fail. You're not supposed to fail. So it's been a whole new learning process for me, where it's totally okay to fail, and it's actually part of the process.
How do you deal with hecklers?
Hecklers, I'm very lucky. I feel like the kind of people who come to my shows tend to be very polite and not heckle. I haven't gotten heckled so far, so I'm still waiting. I've thought about so many times in the shower of everything that I'm going to say to my first heckler, but it's never happened. And I think that all of my bravado happens internally, so I think if it ever happened in real life, I honestly think I'd just cry. So we'll see what happens with my first heckler.
Do you miss being a lawyer at all?
I really miss my clients. I really loved working with refugees, and I really loved helping them navigate a very difficult system. And I really miss that aspect of the work, but I don't miss the bureaucracy. I don't miss the billings. I don't miss the timesheets. There's so much that I really don't miss about being a lawyer. Yeah.
So being a comedian isn't something that we're told we can become while growing up. We're told to be a doctor or an accountant or something like that. But you became a lawyer, which is one of the approved professions by South Asian parents.
One of 4 approved professions, yeah.
And then you just said, screw it, and you just did what you wanted to do.
I think there's still such a huge element of fear in what I do, just because I was a lawyer for a long time and I started stand-up comedy late, like I was in my early 30s. So it's weird to find a skill that you're good at in your early 30s that you didn't even know could be a career, especially for someone like me. So that's all been a huge surprise, and I would say that I tried to do half and half for as long as possible because I didn't trust myself and I didn't trust that this could all work out. And I really only became a full-time comedian mid last year because the opportunities kept coming and I had to choose. And I think unless I was forced to choose, I would still be quite cowardly about it. I would have still tried to do half and half for as long as possible, I think.
But you have an incredible support system.
Yeah, I do now. I think, I don't know, I feel like parents are so worried about you, your family is so worried about you, and then I feel like you pass 30 and they're like, look, anything's fine. So I think it also helped that I started later. And if I was younger, I think that this is not something that would have been encouraged or supported in my family. And luckily, now that I'm 38 years old now, I have found that I can confidently say, hey, I'm doing comedy.
There are so many young Sri Lankan girls who watch you online, who watch other female comedians online, and you give them the hope that it is a great life when you become a comedian. So to them, what do you have to say?
There is so much space for you. There is so much space for you, and I think the biggest obstacle will be yourself, and ignore that. Continue despite that, because if you don't try, there are so many cliche quotes about this for a reason, but it's so true. If you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. I think that's a Michael Jordan quote. Oh my gosh, I've quoted a sports person at a literary festival. But it's so true, and I think about what would have happened if I'd never taken that first step and gone to that comedy competition. My life would be so different, and I would have never discovered this whole other side to myself and of everything that I'm now capable of. And I want that for every person out there, especially young girls.
My last question to you, how important is it to keep believing in the beauty of this entire human experience, in the magic that exists whilst living this life?
And watching the news, right? Like, it's a very difficult thing to hold on to that magic, and I feel like it's so easy when you're younger. There's so much you find magical about the world, and slowly your eyes start getting opened to the brutal realities that are around us. But I think that's why it's so important to find something that brings you joy. Like, you can't be 100% positive about everything all the time, but everyone will have that one thing that lights them up after a really bad day. And whether that's a person or a hobby, an occupation, a thing, a pet, it's just hold on to that, nurture that, because that's going to be that source of light when things get really, really bad. And for me, that's comedy. It's my friends, it's my family, it's being here. And it's reading, it's books, it's just, any source that you can pull that light from, run towards it.
Amazing. Sashi Perera, congratulations with your new book. I'm looking forward to the launch and to reading the book. Good luck with all your shows, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Next guest is Saraid de Silva. She's the author of Amma, a New Zealand writer of Sri Lankan descent. Welcome to the show, Saraid.
Thank you for having me.
Saraid, the South Asian mother stereotype is the one who almost gets lost by the wayside. She silently runs the home, engages in self-sacrifice throughout, and her entire identity becomes wife, mother. She loses herself in the process of becoming a wife, becoming a mother. And this is quite a common thread in the Sri Lankan mother's story, in the South Asian mother's story specifically. Speak to us about how you view this.
I am interested in women. I'm interested in women's identity outside of that, I think. But I don't, not in a way where I want to like denigrate that experience. Like being, like taking care of people and taking care of a home is really important and beautiful thing. And women should be allowed to be like many different things outside of that. And it should be fine to not want any of that. Yeah. You know? Yeah, so my book is about mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, and the relationships that they have with each other. But the women are like scary, I think, and also kind of glamorous, like I think the fear they evoke in people is kind of glamorous.
Yeah.
And they are still women who do those like traditionally domestic things as well.
Right.
So I feel like, for me personally, I'm interested in stories that include the things that women already live through rather than trying to pretend they don't exist.
Absolutely, and I want to allude to the fact that when history is told, oftentimes it's from the point of view of the male, where women's stories get left behind, where women's agency and power, those stories get left behind, and it's mainly passivity, subjugation that we witness through texts, through literature, the majority. So how do we take back our power? So how do you harness this power of women through your work?
Oh, okay. Like harnessing women's power. I think that, okay, so when you're talking about this, like when you're talking about women being powerful, like the phrase that comes to mind for me is like strong female characters, and that's not a phrase that I really love, because I don't want women to only have to be strong to be valuable.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense? Like
yeah.
it's, your characters don't have to be what I want for the characters I write is that they can be allowed the same complexity, and what I want from the characters I read in books. Like, I want like women, like gender non-conforming characters. I want like everyone who isn't a cis het man to be afforded the same kind of complexity. So I feel like there is a lot of power in, I don't know, kind of in nuance, or in, which is why, like, with your previous question, when we were talking about like women occupying like traditional domestic roles, or like how that's portrayed, I feel like every aspect or every role we play, we can like find power within it, or we can completely like circumnavigate those roles and be different.
Yeah, that makes sense. So
that's how I feel.
Yeah, so there is deep nuance. There is a lot of strength and power in allowing oneself to rest, to feel rested, to be soft.
Yeah,
and that
yes.
too is power.
Or just it is, that can be a part of who you are without being something that you need to feel bad about. Because I think sometimes with this like power discussion, what contributes, I think that contributes to women feeling like they need to do everything. Like, you need to be like prosperous and effective and successful in every single aspect. You know, me personally, I don't want to get married or have children, and that's not something that I feel like I need.
Yeah.
And I don't currently feel bad about that, and I don't ever want to feel bad about that, because those are just things I don't want to choose for my life.
Yeah. So the freedom to just be.
Definitely the freedom to be, and also the fact that you should make choices. I'm not very into choice feminism, because I do feel like our decisions are always political. Like, it's a political decision for me to choose to not have children, right?
Yeah.
I feel like choice is important, but I also feel like there's politics in all your decisions.
Absolutely, and also economic power.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And privilege.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's wild that women who work in the home they are elevating their family, or they're like elevating the power that their partner is able to access, right? Because like, if you have someone that is taking care of your household, you can like rise up in your work, because you don't have to think about any of those things.
Correct.
So like that is still like incredibly valuable, and that's like, that contributes to the economy, the work that women do in the home.
Absolutely.
And it's not, they're not paid for it.
Correct.
Yeah, I just think that there's so many discussions about that seem to me to be lying about how much it benefits the entire household, like that role.
And yet it isn't recognized.
It's not recognized, but also women should be paid for it, and men can't afford their wives. Do you know what I mean? If they had to pay, they were paying her to do those jobs, they wouldn't be able to afford it.
Exactly, precisely. Speak to me also about your fascination with women taking revenge.
Yes. So Amma, my book is, I describe it as a story about migration, rage, and revenge. There is like a sexual assault that happens in the book, and that's not something I would ever want to write into a body of work without seeing the person who perpetrated it getting their comeuppance. I don't want to like leave actions like that sort of, that needs to be answered for. So the violence against women that happens in my book is the women sorted out. And that's what I want to read about. I don't want to pretend that these things don't happen to us. I want to read, and I want, obviously, like, ideally live in a world where that doesn't happen. But if I'm writing about it, it has to be attended to. So that's why I was interested in revenge in my book, because I think that I can't bring awful things like that into the conversation without dealing with them appropriately.
In terms of power structures and power dynamics, do you also feel, Saraid, that women are the internalized misogyny in women keeps them away from reaching their potential, reaching their power.
Yeah, I think that in the internalization of misogyny and internalized racism, or like internalizing heteronormativity, those things take so many years to unravel. And yeah, I do think that just like centering men and centering male approval hurts us so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think that those things we like have to keep having conversations about how to not do that effectively, and like how to do that evenly. Like we have to do it across the board. You know, you can't just decenter. You need to decenter approval from like your male colleagues, your like the person that your father. Like I don't know. Like,
yeah.
It's really important to we have to sort of make that very comprehensive.
Right.
And I do think that like some people who've been able to attack and unravel their internalized racism haven't been able to approach their internalized misogyny. And so I just think we have to, everything is connected, right? Like all oppression is connected. So we have to sort it out, I guess, in ourselves.
Saraid, Amma is your first book, and you're doing the festival circuit.
I guess.
How has that process and journey been? Are you loving it? You also you were speaking about your fantastic podcast, so also talk to us about that.
Yes. Okay. So my book came out in March in 2024. It came out in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I live. It came out in Australia, and it came out in the United Kingdom. And yeah, I have really enjoyed talking to people about it. But sometimes I think that like the work is like, okay, so David Lynch said this, and obviously, you know, RIP. After he died, like a lot of his really amazing quotes were kind of resurfaced, but he said when people ask him to talk about his films, he says that the film is the talking. Like I feel like I've put all my ideas and like passions and kind of I put the things I love in this book. So I have loved talking about it, but I loved writing it more. I like meeting readers, and yeah, I made a video and audio series in Aotearoa with my friend Julie Zhu called Conversations with My Immigrant Parents for Radio New Zealand. It's all online. And we travelled around the country and spoke to migrant and refugee families about their experiences in Aotearoa. So, I don't know, that was like a really amazing project. It didn't inform this book because this book is like much more based on my family or like informed by my experiences, but it showed me that there are so many migrant people of colour have so many more commonalities with one another and with Indigenous communities than we do with white settlers or white colonisers. And I'm also a settler or a coloniser in New Zealand because I'm not Indigenous, but there's like things that relate between us that do not relate to white people. Anyway, no, I have loved talking about the book, but writing it's the thing. Yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. Saraid de Silva, thank you for this conversation. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much for having me.
The People's Platform.
Companies play better politics than the politicians of today.
We are not supposed to play with the people's expectation. Then it will be a huge disaster.
When you're bankrupt and when you're going to bankruptcy, two different.
The grandfather is saying it is going to take this long. What does he know?
It's about lack of sense of humor in Sri Lankans.
Issues that matter the most. Unfiltered discussions. Real answers. Face to Face, Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on TV1.
ජාතික මෙහෙවරින් අපි කතා බහ කරන්නේ පුරුෂ පාර්ශවයට කාන්තා පාර්ශවයට වෙනසක් නැතුව ආයුර්වේදයට අනුව ලස්සන වෙන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා.
හොඳම මොයිස්චරයිස් එක තමයි කොමඩු.
යම්කිසි වයස් මට්ටම් වලට පැමිණෙනකොට ඇති වෙන බෝන් නොවන රෝග තත්ත්වයන් තුලදී කොයි ආකාරයෙන්ද ඇස ආරක්ෂා කරගන්නේ?
බහුලවම අන්ධභාවයට පත්වන රෝගී තත්ත්ව ගත්තොත් ඇත්තටම ලෝකේ ලංකාවේ දෙකම නම්බර් 1 ඇත්තටම තියෙන සුද ඇහි සුද.
නිරාමිෂ සිතුවිලි වලින් තමයි පිබිදෙන්නේ. ඒ වුණාට ප්‍රශ්නේ ටික වෙලාවක් යනකොට වෙනස් පැත්තකට යන්න පුළුවන්.
මූලික අරමුණ සියදිවි හානි වැළැක්වීම වුණාට ඕනම කෙනෙකුට ඕනම ප්‍රශ්නයක් ඕනම ගැටලුවක් ගැන කතා කරන්න අපිත් එක්ක යොමු වෙන්න පුළුවන්.
ජාතික මෙහෙවර සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 11ට. මේ වසන්තේ මේ ආරාධනය විසේකාර දඟකාර හැඩකාර කුමාරයන්ට සහ කෝල කොමල මනලෝල කුමාරියන්ටයි මේ වසන්තේ සිරස වසන්ත කුමරා සහ කුමරිය ලෙස කිරුළු පළදින්න දැන්ම සැරසෙන්න වයස අවුරුදු 18ත් 25ත් අතර කුමාරයන් සහ කුමාරියන් මෑතකදී ගත් ඡායාරූපයක් සමග පෙබරවාරි 20 වෙනිදාට පෙර අයදුම් කරන්න. ලිපිනය නිෂ්පාදක සිරස වසන්ත කුමරා සහ කුමරිය ස්ටයින් ස්ටුඩියෝ බොරුපන පාර රත්මලාන. පිවිසෙන්න awurudu.sirasatv.lk.
What is the measure of a champion? A pursuit of greatness, a fire that burns bright, diligent and relentless, no time for respite, to inspire generations, past and present combined.
The People's Platform.
Good evening. I am in conversation with Shyala Smith. She's a UK-based children's book author, originally from Sri Lanka, balancing multiple identities and ethnicities. Good evening and welcome, Shyala.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Shyala, you are also working on a psychological thriller and you work as a screenwriter. You have an advertising background. Shyala, your children's book, The Language of Flowers, tackles the very difficult topic of death and dealing with grief. These are not emotions that we usually expose our children to. What made you want to talk about death, and how did you approach it in your children's book?
Well, it started when my daughter was about 5. We used to live next to the Kanata, and she would see the funeral processions all the time. And one day she asked me, why are the flowers white? And at that moment I had to think of a number of ways to answer this question, but I said, okay, white flowers are common and that's part of our culture. But then it got me thinking about what if the flowers were colorful and that was like a celebration of life, and that's not something that we kind of portray at funerals. And then the idea started slowly emerging in terms of how I would put that into a children's story. I didn't want to make it morbid. I wanted to just lightly make it enjoyable for children, and also then for them to come to their own conclusion of death and how to process grief.
Mental health and identity are also two themes that intersect quite often in your writing. You're writing for adults. You have a novel that's in the publishing stages. You also are working on several screenplays. Take us through how important it is to focus on mental health and identity and how the two intersect. And this is an issue that a lot of us go through.
Yeah. So I think they stem from my interest in very strong female leads who also go through a variety of cultural and patriarchal society, and how they kind of deal with these issues and navigate the system basically. So I am more interested in that because I come from a mixed heritage. My mom's Tamil, my dad's Burgher, and I moved to the UK. I've lived in the US as well, and all those also now kind of creates this new identity, and I have to navigate that. And I feel like those are the topics that I want to speak about and write about, and psychological thrillers have always been something that I have been obsessed by.
Sri Lankans are no stranger to cultural erasure, language erasure. This is sadly a part of the Sri Lankan experience for mainly minority communities, also for women, also for other disenfranchised groups of our society. Take us through what your experience has been in this respect.
Yeah, like I mentioned, because I come from a background of sort of during the Civil War, I grew up during the Civil War, and my mom was a Tamil, and the issues that they faced, and that sort of also kind of led to us not growing up knowing the language, and somehow being a Burgher sort of made it a comfortable situation in some sense. So we used to go and say we are Burghers, and I feel like all of that is lost as you grow up as an adult, and you find that parts of your identity are completely lost. And I try to tackle them in the stories that I tell, and that also brings about a lot of mental health issues in some sense, and to navigate all those different parts is what I try to bring out in my writing. And they're all Sri Lankan stories at the end of the day. Even though they are immigrant perspectives, the lead characters are always Sri Lankan.
In your writing, Shyala, you also speak about the immigrant experience. The immigrant essentially has to forge a new identity in a new location. Take us through that.
Yeah, so what I feel like as a person who already has sort of an identity crisis, and now you take on an immigrant perspective of it, you have to also learn new aspects, or you're also exposed and it shows you that you are not the person you were, and now you need to like step into all these other identities. And the immigrant person, because also you're probably starting from the beginning, if you obviously go back when you are in your 30s. So all those facets kind of play into this kind of person that you need to become, and it gets complicated. So navigating it is just quite hard.
As a South Asian, as a Sri Lankan who is living in the UK, how important do you think it is to decolonize one's mind?
Oh, that's very, very, it's a very tough topic, and I think it'll take a broader discussion of it. But because I am Burger, part of the colonization also sort of like is in me, right? And then going back to, not going back actually, going to the UK, I feel, this is my personal opinion, is that I feel somewhat at home. And that's a very, very difficult thing to kind of like understand, and I'm still trying to process it. Yeah, I hope maybe in the future, if I live long enough in the UK, that I will figure it out. But there's a lot of similarities. It's almost like I have grown up in that situation. So, yeah.
Earlier on, you mentioned that you are drawn to strong female leads. This also essentially entails that you call out the patriarchy and the misogyny and the chauvinism that we are surrounded by as a society. How do you tackle this?
So all my strong female characters, they generally have a secret, right? And that's pretty much the same with anybody writing characters. And that secret, I think, is the one that is impactful in terms of like how I have to address these different components. And I try to do it by bringing also other marginalized stories into the conversation, and then try and bring it out into the whole scene. So I would think like tackling specific parts of it requires also putting ourselves into other characters, other patriarchal characters, and seeing what their stories, why their stories contributed to this whole situation. So I try to do it as delicately as possible, because I also feel like some of them weren't as educated in society to know how to handle it. So I feel a mixture of like, I need to handle this with care. It could be a Sri Lankan thing, yeah.
Shyala, your books are published in the UK by UK publishing companies. How difficult is it for you to grapple with the Western way or the Western conception of storytelling? Because I think South Asians, especially Sri Lankans, are so used to this folk tale-like way of storytelling where it rambles on a bit, whereas in the Western way of looking at storytelling, it's more structured and definitive.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most challenging parts of writing for a Western audience, because they are very strong and quite content with the storytelling of the hero's journey, which starts with an inciting incident and the transformative journey. And I find it quite hard telling this story, because as a South Asian consumer of South Asian stories, I can see all the never-ending type of teledrama sort of structure. And trying to find the happy medium and balancing this out has been extremely challenging. I won't say that I have found the right balance, but I am trying to get there.
Shyala, I'd like you to read us an excerpt from your book, The Language of Flowers. This is a children's book which focuses on grief and death. But before reading an excerpt, I'd like you to preface it for us.
Yeah, so the basic story is that Juhi, the main character, knows the language of flowers, basically the language of faith, the language of love, but she does not know the language of grief. So when her favorite neighbor passes away, her father decides to create this bouquet of flowers, white flowers. So I'll take you through the story from there. A million white flowers scattered all around. Lilies, orchids, carnations, gardenias, and daisies to say how sad we are, says Appa. Would you like to come along to deliver them? Juhi has an idea. Appa, before we go, can I make a bouquet for Mr. Potter too? Certainly. Juhi zooms through the shop. Lively roses, cheerful sunflowers, calming hydrangeas, courageous gladioli, resilient heliconias, soothing marigolds. I'm ready. Juhi stands at the door, a splash of color against a sea of white. Mrs. Potter, I made Mr. Potter a garland of all his favorite flowers from his travels around the world. Mrs. Potter wipes her eyes. What a treasure you are, Juhi. It's just like one of Mr. Potter's hugs. Every time I look at it, I will remember what a wonderful life he lived.
Beautiful. Shyala Smith, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you.